Well, you know, in the period since Haunting Connecticut came out in 2009, you know, in many ways the whole world around that kind of filmmaking and a lot of the stuff that I had been doing really seemed to just kind of collapse. It was a triple whammy of the end of the writer's strike, which we could talk for hours about what a disaster that was and how, you know, how that, the ramifications, how much we're still feeling the ramifications of choices made about that, then combined with the recession and a moment when the studios were contracting and waking up to realize that, gee, year after year they were making the same amount of money total, so why make so many movies, you know, because you're just going to be cutting up that pie into smaller and smaller slices. So as Cassins mentioned, they really started focusing on making fewer. So what I found really is the kind of movies that I had most been doing, most enjoyed doing, were just becoming impossible to get done. It took forever. Something that, I don't know, at any point before that would have sold in like 2 seconds, would have sold the morning Haunting Connecticut came out, which was a script about the true story on which the movie The Exorcist had been based, which had never been told, the true secret story. And it's really outrageous. And I was partnered with Roy Lee, fantastic producer of these kinds of horror movies. It still took us forever. Everybody wanted to hear the pitch. We were at this moment where nobody wanted to do anything on pitch. No one wanted to develop anything. So just go write it, bring it back. Finally, Summit did, and now that they're in Lionsgate or Warner, I think people finally move forward. But what I found instead, besides just a period of absolute, you know, I don't get it. I've made the most financially successful movie in my career, and suddenly nobody will buy buying anything. Particularly, I had very much in my whole career I'd never written a single thing on spec, which I say both as a point of pride and a point of shame. I should have been doing a lot more spec writing. I didn't have to, because right out of school I was getting these opportunities and assignments, and then lots of rewrite work, and I was always selling pitches, always able to do that. And you know, for better or worse, whether it was Bones or Haunting Connecticut or other ones, they came out from being pitches, and suddenly that was that market just was seeming sort of impossible. What came out of that that's been very good for me, though, is that suddenly I getting calls coming from television production companies and networks going, do you have ideas for series and pilots? So very quickly, after sort of a year of sitting there trying to move things around that other way, I said, well, sure, okay, I've never tried that. I've not even really know that world, and sold a bunch of pilots in a very short order that have turned out pretty well. And so the one I'm most excited about, I'm with a partner, with Brandon Braga, who's a much more experienced showrunner than I am. We are doing a series for FX called Malice, which is a very odd take on the witch panic in Salem in the 1690s. It's going to be really, really fun. And part of the basis of how happy they were with that, and Fox asked Brandon and I together to take on an important film property that they own, the Omen movies, and figure out how to do a series from that. So those are the two series I've been working on, and really enjoying it. It's a whole new world as a writer, I have to say. I love it. It's wonderful. I think for all the same reasons Cassie was talking about, the kinds of movies that the studios don't make, it's interesting because not only, yes, that's moved to independent films, it's also moved to television. So all that is on, it's starting with The Sopranos, obviously, but it's in Homeland. It's in, I don't know if anybody saw the premiere pilot of Bates Motel, a very creative rethinking in a very indie way of of Hitchcock's Psycho. A lot of that kind of filmmaking, especially that kind of writing, has essentially moved on to TV, where they're very happy to have an audience that's over 30 and, you know, literate and all those things. And then as the final one I'll mention that I'm kind of excited about, because it came out of the blue, so I thought, gee, maybe I won't get to make any the kind of horror movies that I loved, which was always just my first love, and got approached out of the blue. Tim Metcalf, with whom I did Haunting Connecticut and a number of other horror films, we got approached by, of all people, a new studio called Amazon. We mostly know from our books and CD buying. And I'm married to a novelist, so she was very encouraging, saying, find out what their business model is, you know, because she, as a writer, as a published novelist, is already experiencing the ways in which, obviously, Amazon is transforming the publishing world. Whether they will, and whether it's a good thing that they will, if they do transform our world too, I don't know. But I felt like I want to find out what that's like. So Tim and I are sort of the first professionals they're hiring, because they've been doing a lot of almost kind of crowdsourcing development, which is very bizarre. But this was a novel, a very good first horror novel by a young Polish-American writer that had been initially self-published, and then for the Kindle, and then it did exceedingly well by pure word of mouth. So Amazon brought it out as a real book and started to publicize it, and then decided it would be a good first test case for them about how to actually create a pipeline from books, especially from e-books, straight to the screen. And it's a very bizarre process, but it's neat. It's interesting how they're doing that, and it appealed to me in part because it goes back to this thing I was saying to you guys before about they're very key on to this idea that finding things that somebody is passionate about, even if it's only 15 people, and trust that passion and think that you can spread that. I'll say 4 words that you will all instantly recognize and groan, but then one of the huge proofs of that, 50 Shades of Grey. This is a book that was available for free for 2 years. And long before it then still managed to sell every book other than the Bible. I mean, it sold more books than Harry Potter has sold. And yet yet came as it was invented for free, it was put out that way. Now, I don't think this is the future of everything, but it is changing a lot of that, and it's going to be interesting to see whether Amazon can come here into our town and find a way to adapt their very unique development methods to do that. The last time I was about that, that's just kind of bizarre, because the agents had to call at the last minute to say, is this okay with you that this is what Amazon's doing? They had to guarantee all our compensation, as you would in any good, normal sort of studio contract. But they're only committing to make, not the movie, but in effect, they will develop scripts that they've developed and work on them, much the way their model is the old studio system. I love that, because I'm buff of that era, and always wished I could have been around in a nice studio deal in the 30s instead. And then what their intention with these is to kind of create almost like those cheaper versions of like those Zemeckis animated movies that really just look like animatics, you know, gone wild. And they're going to be testing the heck out of those, much as if it was an effects-driven thing, even though it's not. Now, whether that's going to work or be a total nightmare, I don't know. But that's what they're going to be testing, in part because they're user-oriented. They are all about, they're like, okay, because they don't like that first generation of movie guys who came out of like the schmata trade. You know, they came out of just selling things to customers. So for better or worse, they are obsessively connected to this feedback loop with their customers. And it is true that that is something I think we are very divorced from in a funny way. You know, we either make movies for ourselves or we make movies for investors or all kinds of other things, and there's very little sense, because we don't, you know, how do we create that kind of a feedback loop? Again, it may well turn out to be a total nightmare, but as an experiment, it was interesting, and I admired the novel, so well, we'll do it.